You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast, a place for real conversations with people who love someone with the disease of addiction. Now here is your host, Margaret Swift Thompson.
Welcome back to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Today, I am delighted to introduce you to my latest guest, Terra Carbert. Terra shares her story of growing up amongst addiction, experiencing loss at a young age, and dealing with her own long-term recovery. Terra opens up about her own addiction with gambling and how she seeks support to keep her recovery a priority. Let's meet Terra.
The Embrace Family Recovery Podcast.
I'm thrilled today to bring you to the show and for people to get a chance to hear from you. And today my guest is Terra Carbert, who is going to share her story with us. And I know families are going to be listening because you have a perspective in your story that isn't necessarily commonly shared or talked about. So thank you for being with. And I'd love to start by having you introduce yourself in whatever way you'd like to introduce yourself to the audience.
Thanks, Margaret. I'm Terra. I am a person in long-term recovery from lots of things. I think the best way to summarize that would be self-destructive behavior. I grew up in an addicted household, so you could say ACLA would apply to me. There's lots of A meetings I could go to when I'm engaging in 12-step. I am personally impacted by a gambling addiction, so I am little over 7 years without placing a bet on anything about myself since I found and started really living a life of recovery. So now I do several things. I host a podcast called Ambitious Addicts, similar to yours. All addictions are highlighted, and then all pathways to healing. I just like people to come and tell their stories and kind of lay that out in a message of experience, strength, and hope. And I'm the founder of the Self Discovery Sisterhood, which was born out of an expansion of some coaching services that I do for self-discovery mindset coaching.
And we were just chatting before we got on and at how different life looks with recovery, how things are possible with recovery. So I know this will be a hopeful podcast. And before we move into the hope of it, if you'd be willing to go back and share a little of your story. You share that you are from a family of the disease. And how early were you when you remember thinking, whew, something's wrong, something's off?
I think there's a memory that stands out really, really well of witnessing my stepfather tearing a phone book in half after an argument with my mother, and knowing that was wrong, but not connecting the dot that maybe alcohol played a part in that reaction. And then I'd say as a teenager, I became, maybe preteen even, I became more conscious of how like alcohol was always present at everything that my family did, but not when I went to other people's houses. And starting to hear the sentences of like, he was just drunk or she was just drunk, or the excuse making that can happen when we have loved ones with addiction, and having the substance be the thing that gets the blame for the bad behavior. But definitely as a young teen, there's some real standout memories of counting the number of drinks consumed, counting the number of cigarettes in the ashtray. Those types of things for me really stand out as like, that must be when I was really aware that this wasn't normal, because I was counting and comparing, and like I was building some case that there was a problem. But everyone in my family drank, and almost everyone in my family used cigarettes as well.
When you talk about noticing it was different when you were at other people's houses.
Mm-hmm.
That is such a familiar part of the story that even little ones don't necessarily really know any different, because this is the norm, right? Where we live is where we live. And then when we start exploring other people's homes and visiting friends, maybe having a sleepover, going over after school for dinner and hanging out, whatever it is, then you see differences in family.
Yeah.
Do you hear that a lot also when talking to people?
Yeah. Yeah. I think, we grow up this is our normal, right? And I think many of us believe our normal is the same as everybody else's normal until we see that that's not how they live. Yeah.
You moved into your own addiction that you identified and your own recovery. Did anyone else in your family get help for their addiction? Have you been one to blaze the trail, or have people found help?
Definitely blazed the trail. My mom died of cancer when I was 25. And in her last 6 months of life, she had stopped drinking and stopped smoking. But that was not necessarily a recovery path per se, as much as it was more so like, I hate the way this tastes or feels in my body. And she started to be disgusted by the smell of cigarettes. And she may have asked, though, about some pain relief with a different type of substance, and if I knew anyone who could get it for her.
So the disease was alive and well. It
was. And gambling, I didn't even recognize. I mean, I recognized the alcohol, and the nicotine dependence. I did not recognize that gambling was an addiction in my growing up world either. I didn't think of gambling as an addiction. And of course, after having experienced, I certainly do now.
Which brings up another good point. A question I would be curious to ask is, when you grew up watching this happen and becoming more aware in your family, did you have a conscious thought of, I will not drink like that, or I will not use nicotine, or were you any kind of reaction to that when you were coming up through that?
Sure, coming up through it, I was like, I'm never going to do that, right? And sure enough, I did all the things.
Okay.
I did all the things I said I was never going to do. And at the same time, I would say that determination to not become addicted to alcohol likely just shifted my disease to a different behavior. And that behavior was gambling.
I get that.
Yeah. So there was some part of me that knew, like, it's wrong to get drunk every weekend. It's wrong. Like, it didn't feel right for me. Right. And I didn't keep alcohol in the home. So there were things that very much informed how I became a parent and my relationship with alcohol, almost like a limit I had put on myself. I guess that was conscious, but I didn't really realize the disease of addiction was already alive and well within me. And I was just turning it to different things, because I was like, well, I know I can't do that much of drug A, drug B. So I danced around with a lot of substances and could have become addicted to any one of them. But gambling is the thing that sunk its teeth into me, got me crawling into the rooms.
I appreciate your candor there. And I think a lot of that is so important for families to hear, because they do not often understand that, well, the concept of cross addiction. I think your story demonstrates that it is a no-fault disease that creates powerlessness and unmanageability, because you were adamant you weren't going to be like that person or do those things. And I think if it were up to willpower and our capacity to not, there we would have the answer that this wasn't a disease within us. Right. Would you agree with that with your own journey?
I would agree with that with my own journey. And I would say the interesting thing about my relationship with substances is that I didn't, we often talk about that invisible line of going from problematic use into addiction. I didn't cross that invisible line with the other things. Mm. And I certainly did with the gambling. And so I can look at my history and go, oh yeah, I'm a person who lives with the disease of addiction. And I need to manage my disease.
I need to manage my disease. It's a good way of framing it. What does managing your disease look like? for you?
Yeah. And I think this is something that's like super important to talk about. At least it is for me. Personal passion for me is that all pathways are valid. It's like whatever the hell works for you. Also should ask about language. I'm a person who swears. Is that something that your show tolerates or no? Whatever it takes for you, whatever works for you. So what works for me is 12-step recovery. Therapy was heavier in the beginning, the therapy kind of on an as needed basis. If I'm encountering something from the past that I really can't unpack effectively on my own, and coaching as a modality to be future focused. And my meetings really keep me very present focused. So it's kind of like, what tool do I need based on what it is that I'm in the midst of? But meetings are kind of my medicine. And what that looks like for me is at least one in-person 12-step meeting a week, at least one conversation with my sponsor, and at least one conversation with a sponsee. Could go up or down, and some fellowship with others in recovery too. That's what works for me today. I don't know if that will be what works for me tomorrow, but it's working today. And I've maintained abstinence from gambling and also now choose not to drink almost at all. I had like a sangria in BC, an intentional drink to go with an Italian meal. So yeah, it's evolved too, because, as my recovery has changed, so has what I need.
This podcast is made possible by listeners like you.
When I reflect on my decades of work with families of people with the disease of addiction, I have seen few siblings get the same resources provided, partners, parents, or even children. Numerous siblings have told me they felt they couldn't share in a traditional Al-Anon or Nar-Anon meeting because the parents' and partners' pain seemed so much more significant than their own. The Embrace Family Recovery Coaching Group for Siblings will meet for 6 groups coaching sessions, including education on the no-fault disease, connection with other siblings, strategizing together communication, boundary setting, and some surprise guests who are siblings themselves. This summer course for siblings begins Tuesday, July 16th, and the group will be for participants ages 16 years and older. To find out more, head to my website or hit the link that you'll find in my show notes below.
You're listening to the Embrace Family Recovery Podcast. Can you relate to what you're hearing? Never miss a show by hitting the subscribe button. Now back to the show.
I love your concept of throw whatever we've got at this illness. Because I think that one of the things that comes up a lot is anger and resentment towards the person. And I always say, why are we letting the disease get off scot-free? It's what's creating the turmoil. It's what's changing the person. It's what's changing our lives and our stability. So I love that. Throw everything we got at the disease. I would also say throw all of our pain and anguish at the disease while loving the person. Like, how do we do that separation? Were you able to do that with your family, being the other side of the coin with their journey, or were you not given much for tools at that point to know how to navigate it?
The latter, but not for lack of tools per se, but lack of time. So I was pretty young when my mom died. And then my father raised me, called my dad. It's a lovely, fun story there too. But he died 10 years later, also in his disease, and was trying to learn how to love him through that and his grief, while also kind of becoming more active in my own addiction. And so with more time, kind of like, well, with more time. So I had to actually learn how to do that without them being alive. Because there was a lot of anger and resentment about the state of me being a human raised in an alcoholic household, that I didn't get to process directly with them in their earthly experience. And so I'm teared up over here because it still sits there a little bit. Like, how do I release this fully? How do I fully give the forgiveness when they're not here to have that with? So in BC, I picked up a phone at a cemetery. It's a phone to the wind that's intended to allow you to have conversations with loved ones who've passed on.
Oh,
Yeah. So I'm still working on what does that look like with them having passed. I think I've done it in my heart, but it's hard. You don't get the conversation.
and I know that there are people out there who are in your same shoes and haven't even maybe broached the idea of doing the healing without them being alive.
Yeah.
So what have you found helpful in the work that you've done?
I just like, I'm more like talking to them like they're here,
Yeah.
imagining like the best version of them being the one that responds and explains. And also, I think I have this benefit of having lived with addiction. So also being able to very much empathize that like, okay, that's probably not what they wanted to do or how they wanted to treat you. And we all do the best that we can with what we've got. And I recognize their history too, that they each had their own unique set of circumstances and how they were raised that influenced then how they carried that forward. So, um, talking to them like they're alive, imagining what they would say in their healed state, writing stuff down, like writing letters and all the things, like burning them, putting them in a flowing river, like whatever. I've tried a whole lot of things, but I think the conversations, probably the pretend discussions, are probably the ones that have helped me the most.
Beautiful. And I'm sorry you lost them so young. That's really hard.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And that's another resentment thing I gotta, I still work through. Like if somebody's complaining about a parent, you're lucky you have them. Sometimes they'll throw that at people. I'm working on that.
At the end of the day, we're all human, right? And so
Yes.
we're never perfect and we have a lot of growing to do. And there's new steps and stages as we go along. And I think having grace with ourselves is so vital.
So vital.
And also gives you that ability to have grace with them, like you said, to understand that they didn't want this either, but they were trapped by their disease. And that's what I got.
Yeah. Yeah. Your comment about the blaming the disease, or blaming not the disease, blaming the person and not the disease. I just watched Painkiller.
Haven't seen it.
And there is quite a bit of narrative that comes from the pharmaceutical company to blame the addict and not the disease of addiction, and definitely not the addictive pill. So,
wow.
Yeah.
We yet to do, right?
Yeah, but that's where we get a lot of messaging in the world around us about addicts. And I own that phrasing. I did introduce myself as a person in long-term recovery from many things. But yeah, I'm an addict. The name of my podcast is Ambitious Addicts, because for me, that's kind of owning this part of my identity in a shameless way. I don't have any shame about my disease.
It's like taking the word that's used against somebody in a vile or ugly way and saying, I'm going to say it and own it. And the other thing for me, it's remembering I'm one bite away, one
right
drink.
There. That's it.
That's why that word helps me.
Yeah.
It is definitely not shaming. It is empowering for me. If somebody else labels me it in a derogatory way, we'll have a whole different conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. Lots of talk about this in the mental health profession in particular, right? Like, don't call me an addict, but I can call myself whatever I want.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's talk about your gambling journey. Let's talk about how that started. What age? What the avenue?
Yeah. I'll go all the way back to the beginning before I was even gambling and talk about early exposure.
Okay.
I had a really strong relationship with my grandfather. He was kind of standing in this in between when my biological father died by suicide when I was 3. And Grandpa kind of stepped in and filled a bit of a fatherly gap for a long time, was my biggest cheerleader and obviously sidekick. And he would take me to the VFW where he would play poker with his 4 buddies in Baka Point cribbage. And he played the football numbers and he played the pull tabs and he played all the things. And I learned all the things. I learned how to play blackjack probably before I learned how to consistently make my bed. And I thought it was so fun. And then I went to the horse horse races like once, I think when I was younger, and he placed a bet for me. So that exposure, I think, is where I developed a connection with gambling and the games. And there was something about that, especially with the cards for me, kind of, they would call it big shotism in our program. I kind of felt like a bit like I'm the girl at the table, raking the pot. So I played a lot of card games. And I did get introduced, the casinos here in Minnesota. You can gamble at the age of 18 in the casinos. And so that was my primary form of gambling, was casino gambling and a lot of cards, which, when people imagine a compulsive gambler who's a woman, they imagine a lot of slot machines. And so it was cards and in multiple forms. That was probably the early start of my disease. And the turning on of that was in my late teens, early 20s. And as you can imagine, when my mom got sick, the volume went up. I hadn't crossed the line yet to addiction, but I see problem use back then. And then a little bit of, oh, what am I doing? And then a big escalation again later after my grandmother died. And my grandmother, the wife of the grandpa I talked about, she would come visit me for about a month at a time. And one of the outings she liked to do was go to the casino and play. She had favorite slot machines. I would say she was kind of a controlled gambler, but I would go sneak and get more money out of the cash machine and play longer because I burst through my money very quickly. And it really escalated. It escalated again then. And that dance with gambling, along with a number of other storms that, grandma dies, I start going to the casino more, start going by myself, I start betting more, dad dies, I start more bad work experience, and so gambling became the thing that I went to either escape an emotion I didn't want to experience or alter the emotional experience I was having, or to generate fun or excitement or something pleasurable. And it turned into the thing I used to cope with the reality I didn't cope.
When you talk about this, it sounds very familiar to every story around alcohol, drugs, food.
Yeah.
For some reason, people have a different feeling about gambling.
Mm.
It's not talked about as freely. Education around it as an addiction is less.
Mm.
When you say, I danced or tangoed with different substances, but there was always somewhat of a limit, didn't see this as an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
When was it that penny dropped and you went, oh, this is really no different than what I've observed in others?
Not until I had my rock bottom moment, as we say. Maybe a little earlier than that, when I was trying to control it and I couldn't.
Part of your journey was, okay, this is getting out of hand. I got to pull back. I got to navigate it, negotiate with it, try to do less of it.
Yeah. And I wish I could say that it was because of anything other than the financial consequences. It's not, that was it. But there was a wake up moment too. But I took steps to try to protect myself from myself. And at that point, I was really, by awareness of this is a problem, was certainly escalating. But I still don't think I thought of it as an addiction yet, until I found recovery and until I started really researching how do I get help. And I didn't do that until I had thoughts of suicide on my last day. I mean, that's the unique thing about gambling. Is gambling weaves this story of, the promise to win. The other, I'll speak substances, substances, we all kind of consciously are aware this could kill me.
Right.
That my body could deteriorate, that I could overdose. That's there, that death warning. It's there. Same for cigarettes, right? But with gambling, there's no death warning. And our overdose is suicide. That's how it ends for a lot of people. 5 times the rate of suicide of any other addiction in the studies that I've seen published. And not a lot of studies, because a lot of people don't see this as an addiction. They see it as a pastime or something fun that people do together. And when people perceive gamblers, at least from what I've read, it's like this degenerate, you're a degenerate. And it's very much an invisible addiction. So people don't see it, smell it, hear it.
Very secretive. Could be.
I was living in two worlds. No one knew. Not no one, but no one knew. No one knew how bad it was.
So that's another component that I think is really interesting from the family perspective, is because it is so secretive and the bottom is so destructive to your age, which like the warning signs are not as easily seen and the end is so dire. What were the people around you saying, seeing, noticing, doing as you were getting worse in your addiction?
Well, it was more so like, I haven't seen you in forever. Isolation in actually in action as well. So going, by myself, I was a casino gambler, going by myself to gambling establishments, not making commitments or plans, not following through. And then some asking people to lend me money started to show up as I had run out or depleted the resources that I had to access my own. And the question, I was a high earner, and the question of like, how, I'm asking a friend who earns less than me to lend me money. And then the lying starts, and then the delay, like, oh, sorry, I messed this thing up in my budget. Like, could you just lend me a couple $100 till next Friday when I get paid? And then some excuse coming the next Friday, and just kind of that, what's going on, Tara? Like, this isn't, you make X, transparent with my friends about how much money I earn. You make X, I make this. Why? This doesn't add up, but I always had an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one thing. Like, if suddenly someone who's not ever had financial issues is suddenly asking you to lend them money, that could be a warning sign.
Sure.
The other, mood and irritability and the lack of kind of commitment to come do the thing. I'm somebody who really loves to spend time with friends and family, and I was non-committal. Like, oh, I'm not sure I can make it, because in the back of my mind, I was planning the next trip to gamble. Like, oh, what if I want to gamble that day? I don't know. I don't know if I can come to your birthday party.
Want to keep the option open.
I want to keep the option open to go engage my addiction.
Were you in a primary relationship at that point when your gambling was progressing, or were you single?
A little bit of both. And throughout my gambling history, I'm single and have always been single, like I'm single, never married in that definition, but I've had a couple long-term relationships. I often choose people who had substance use disorder as my partners, some of whom also thought gambling was super fun. So my gambling was never questioned by anyone.
So my language, my disease knows who I need to be with to cover my own addiction.
Yeah, it just wants to stay alive, right?
So ironic, food addict was engaged or dated at least 2 chefs, right? Like, no coincidences. Befriended friends who were either more obese than me or were connected to restaurants, connected to grocery stores, looking back, it's like, how did I not see it? But as you've said so well, I was aware of drugs and alcohol. I had no clue food was an addiction. I didn't think it was, which made it more shameful for me because I thought I was just a weak-willed, pathetic piece of crap.
Yep. Something's wrong with me, right? And of course, yes, something's wrong with us, but we are not inherently flawed. We have a mental health condition that needs treating.
And I really appreciate that way of putting it, because I think that people get angry when a person says, I have a no-fault disease, which is what I truly believe we have. What I don't think people give credence to and understand is that the one thing about our illness that no other illness has is we have the responsibility to clean up the wreckage once we do get into recovery.
We do.
We're responsible for that. And that's actually a beautiful part of recovery that most other illnesses don't get to experience. Hard work, but woof, what a beautiful thing to witness.
Well, back to what we were talking about before we hopped on the recording, right? You made a comment to me. Seems like you do a lot of that. And I said, well, yeah, now that I want to be part of the solution. Well, yeah, but I never thought like that as an addict. It's not what I did. the recovery has changed the entire way that I see myself, that I see the world, that I see my life. And without it,
Yeah.
I'd be dead.
Right.
I truly believe that.
Right. Join us again next time when I continue my conversation with Terra, and she shares the progression of her gambling addiction and the moment she reached out for help. If you're finding value in anything you're hearing, please subscribe and follow where you listen to your podcasts. And if you haven't checked out my YouTube channel, you might want to do that. It's the Embrace Family Recovery YouTube channel, where I offer some resources and information that I don't share anywhere else.
I want to thank my guest for their courage and vulnerability in sharing parts of their story. Please find resources on my website, embracefamilyrecovery.com. This is Margaret Swift Thompson. Until next time, please take care of you